Hello and welcome back everybody to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Hope you all had a fantastic weekend. I know I did, but we are back and better than ever with even more fantasy sports talk. It should be a fantastic show today. We'll kick things off, obviously, with the Celtics-Maveriks Game 2, breaking down the fantasy implications from that game, and then switching over to the hockey realm, where Panthers and Oilers faced off against each other in Game 1 of the Stanley Cup Finals. And stick around for the latter half of the show, where I'll be looking at my bounce-back fantasy football candidates for the upcoming season. Some overvalued, overhyped fantasy players who you might not want to draft earlier than they are projected to go. And then finishing out the show with some even more Euros action. I'll be giving you guys some tips and tricks for building your Euros fantasy squad, so it should be a banger of a show. But before we begin, I always ask that you like, follow, and subscribe to my podcast and the network. We always get a lot of tips and donations, so if you do feel so inclined, please leave a link at the gsmc.cloud. It's a huge support to the network, both me and my fellow podcasters. Also, if you're feeling curious about something I said and you want to leave a question, it will be answered at the beginning of the next episode, so do please consider that. But without further ado, let's get right into what should be a great show. So obviously, we begin with Game 2 of the NBA Finals. An exciting game, a lot closer than a lot of people expected. Obviously, the Mavs led for long periods of time, but it's just the Celtics' timeliness, their togetherness, that ultimately pulled out a 105-98 victory. They take the 2-0 lead as the series shifts to Dallas. But let's just get right into the fantasy implications of today's game. Obviously, despite the loss, Luka was still Luka. 32, 11, and 11 stat line gave him 61.7 fantasy points. The only worrying thing about his performance was his 8 turnovers, which ultimately, if you look at it, could have been one of the reasons that the Celtics ultimately were able to pull this one out. And then on the other side of things, a much more disappointing fantasy performance for the Dallas Mavericks, with Kyrie Irving, who's just been super absent these past 2 games. 16, 2, and 6, but only 25.4 fantasy points at the end of the day. So as you see it, Luka is still being a superstar despite the rumors about his injuries, despite the fact that he might be more gassed than other Dallas Mavericks players on the floor. He's still being Luka. The problem is there is no outside production from any other Dallas Mavericks player, including the guy many expected to be the second best Dallas Mavericks player in this finals in Kyrie Irving, someone who has played for the Celtics before, wanted to go into TD Garden and have good showings, but ultimately has not stepped up to the plate. Now let's go to the Celtics side of things, where a surprising fantasy prospect emerged for them. How about Jrue Holiday, man? 26, 11, and 3 stat line. 47.7 fantasy points for Jrue Holiday, their leading scorer on the night, in a stellar performance that largely was like the difference maker for the Celtics in this game. And then obviously the second best fantasy player in terms of points was obviously Jaylen Brown. 21, 4, and 7, continuing his fantastic development throughout this postseason. As this postseason has gone on, Jaylen Brown has been getting better and better. But let's just talk about how both these teams match up and why there has been such volatility in terms of fantasy for the Celtics, and why Luka has been one of the better fantasy players in this series despite the fact that his team is losing. Let's just start off with Luka. Obviously, no matter what happens with Luka Doncic, he is still going to be Luka Doncic. He just has a fantastic, intangible mindset when it comes to the game of basketball, and he can produce at any level of the floor for both himself and his teammates. And we saw it last night. He was doing his best. But ultimately, the Dallas Mavericks role players have not stepped up to the plate. Notice how in the past couple of episodes, I have not mentioned names like Dan Gafford or Derek Lively or even PJ Washington, because they have been non-factors. And that is a testament to the Celtics' on-ball and three-point defense. They are saying that Luka Doncic will be Luka Doncic, and there's no changing that aspect of the Dallas Mavericks. However, we are going to key in on what the Dallas Mavericks did best to get to this point, the corner three, and stick with them in that perimeter area so that Luka Doncic really has nowhere to go with the ball and is forced to score himself. And they have been doing this to a T. Obviously, Luka Doncic still had 11 assists and 11 rebounds last night because he's always going to get that at some point. But the point of the Celtics' defensive game plan is that Luka Doncic is not worrying them as a passer as well as a scorer. And that's just been done to a T, and it's reflected in the Celtics' fantasy stats because they've just been spreading the wealth. Last game, Kristaps Porzingis and Jaylen Brown were their leading fantasy scorers, and now it's Drew Holiday's turn. So you can see the Celtics really don't care about who is going to step up to the plate on any given night. They are just so well structured that from 1 through 5, whoever they have on the court is willing to stick to their defensive game plan. Kudos to Joe Mazzulla as well for understanding the fact that you can't change who Luka Doncic is, but you can still change the way he plays the game of basketball. And that is a huge part as to why the Celtics were able to kind of get their heads back into the game and why they were able to pull it out at the end of the day. But looking at another aspect of the Celtics as a fantasy squad, obviously you have so many different players who can give you production on the Celtics in terms of daily fantasy basketball, but I want to focus on one in particular who we've always seemed to come around back to when we are discussing the Celtics as a fantasy team. He's the most scrutinized player, one of the most criticized players in all of the NBA, and also in terms of daily fantasy, mainly due to the fact that point production is not his fantasy forte, and that is Jason Tatum. He had an 18, 9, and 12 stat line last night for 45.8, so by no means was this a terrible fantasy performance for Jason Tatum. But here's why, going forward, for however long this final series goes on, Jason Tatum will always be looked at through a lens of, is he doing enough? That's the question. The bigger question in my mind is the fact that if you as a fantasy player are willing to accept the fact that Jason Tatum's primary fantasy role is not necessarily a point scorer. There are nights where his points will be inflated. There are nights where his distribution is more needed. And we are seeing that in the NBA Finals. Jason Tatum is becoming more of a team player. Now, by no means does that mean I'm telling you to fade Jason Tatum as a fantasy player, because he still put up 45.8 fantasy points last night. But it's a question of if you're looking for aggression from your fantasy basketball team, or a more balanced approach where you have a guy like Tatum who can put up big points, but kind of takes the back seat a little bit. For all intents and purposes, if you want aggression, go for Luka as your main daily fantasy basketball player. Swing for the fences. Spend big on a guy like Luka who's going to get at least maybe even 50% of your fantasy point production for any given night. But if you want someone who's more well-rounded for your fantasy team and you accept the fact that he's going to be not a preeminent, dominant scorer, then by all means choose Jason Tatum, because as we see in these finals, Jason Tatum does not necessarily care about how he performs or how he shoots. Last night he was only 6 for 22 from the field, but still was able to put up fantasy points due to the fact fundamental basketball is what he's focusing on. And that's the reason why the Celtics are up in this series, despite the fact that in terms of fantasy they're spreading the wealth around. They are a team-oriented basketball team. They are not the Dallas Mavericks, who on any given night have to rely on Luka Doncic or Kyrie Irving to step up. Kyrie Irving right now is not stepping up, and Luka Doncic is kind of weathering the storm, man. He has to weather the storm due to the fact that there is no way he can be able to spread the wealth around to players that are covered on the perimeter by the fantastic Celtics defense. It is a mindset that was ingrained in the Celtics at the start of this season, and now it is carried over and coming full circle in the NBA Finals. And that's the thing. the Dallas Mavericks have to figure out a way to shoot the corner three. That's the reason why they are here. The Dallas Mavericks will not win an NBA Finals game if they do not find a way to create those shots, whether it be Luka driving and kicking like the Celtics do a lot of, whether it be Kyrie Irving kind of moving his way in the paint, kind of trying to move the Celtics defense around, get guys like Porzingis and Horford away from the rim so that they get easy looks at the basket, or also getting back to their lob game. We saw a little of it in this game where Luka Doncic was able to get those lob passes to guys like Gafford and Lively, but they need to find a way to A, shoot the corner three, B, get their role players more integrated into the game, and C, make sure that Kyrie Irving plays up to his potential. If they don't do that, then this could be a sweep. Obviously, as the series shift to Dallas, maybe they get that home support advantage that they so vitally need. But right now, I see no way that this fantastic Celtics on-ball defense can be solved, despite the fact that Luka is doing everything he can to carry his Dallas squad over the hump. Because right now, in my honest opinion, I don't care that the Celtics are kind of lagging behind these Luka Doncic in terms of fantasy. Because when you look at that fantasy list, at least 5 of those players are Celtics. And that's the reason why they're winning this final. Luka Doncic is one man. The Celtics are a team. And that's what people have to accept. But that should just about do it for this segment. It was a fantastic time talking basketball. But now we're going to switch into the hockey mindset. The Panthers and Oilers, Game 1 of the Stanley Cup Finals. Who were the big fantasy stars in that game, and who needed to step up in that critical moment for the Oilers in their loss? We will be right back to discuss that Game 1.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Like I said, for today's second segment, we are switching from the NBA to the NHL, where I recap the Panthers-Oilers Game 1 of the Stanley Cup Finals. But before we get into that, I would like to remind you yet again that if you do feel so inclined, do please consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. It is a huge support to both the network, me, and my fellow podcasters, so anything you leave is greatly appreciated. Now, let's get right into it. Basketball to hockey, where the Panthers faced off against the Oilers Saturday night in Game 1 of the Stanley Cup Finals. This was such a very weird game in my opinion, because you had the Oilers doing their thing. They were dominant in the power play, but then they just didn't score any goals. And the Panthers, even though they had much less shots, as always, the Edmonton Oilers, their kind of forte on the defensive end is limiting the amount of shots a given team can get. The Panthers just took those chances and scored them, and it ultimately ended up a 3-0 shutout for the Florida Panthers as they take Game 1 of the Stanley Cup Finals. Now, let's get into fantasy. Obviously, as a goalie, Sergei Bobrovsky had a huge game. Obviously, goalies are one of the best fantasy players in all of fantasy hockey, if they get a shutout. He had 11.4 fantasy points on 32 saves. As you can see, the huge volume of shots the Oilers had did not deter the brick wall that is Sergei Bobrovsky. He was a star in this game. His heroics were the ultimate reason why the Florida Panthers made this look like a dominant victory. Another huge player who I've been asking to step up for the Florida Panthers, imploring to step up on this podcast for quite some time, Carter Verhaeghe. He had 7 fantasy points, had 1 goal in this game, and a plus-minus of 1. So as you can see, Carter Verhaeghe finally stepping up on a bigger stage and being one of the players that Florida can rely on as they kind of structure their team. Another guy who really stepped up as well and was the heartbeat of everything the Florida Panthers did offensively in this game, Alexander Barkov, 9 fantasy points, 2 plus-minus, 2 assists in this game. So one of their most highly touted players doing what highly touted players do. Now on the Oilers end, there really is no one to blame here other than Stuart Skinner. He had 1 fantasy point, but the big stat is 2 goals and only 15 shots. If you are limiting the Florida Panthers, who are a very well-structured team and can get shots from anywhere, to 15 shots, your job as a goalie is to make sure those shots do not find the back of the net. And that has been one of Stuart Skinner's things that people have criticized him on in this postseason. Whether or not Stuart Skinner can be the goalie that really helps make this Oilers defense look even better than it already is. And he just did not step up to the plate tonight. But also their 2 stars did not perform well in terms of fantasy. Connor McDavid only 1.5 points on a -2 plus-minus, and Leon Draisaitl 1.5 points on a -1 plus-minus. So obviously the Oilers stars did not perform well. But there is a reason I said that this game is more decisive than dominant, because of the fact that Florida was outshot by a huge margin. And it's just the fact that the Florida Panthers have a goalie they can rely on any given night, and the Oilers probably do not. Obviously, Stuart Skinner, out of the conference finals, had 2 fantastic games for the Oilers to get back into that series and ultimately win it. But right now, the Florida Panthers have the better goaltending thing, and the Oilers have to figure out a way to solve him, because of the fact that the Florida Panthers are not just Sergei Bobrovsky as well. They have guys they can rely on. And we saw 2 nights ago, rather, the ways that Florida can shut down this Oilers team outside of Bobrovsky. And one big thing that the Florida Panthers can take away from this game is that they shut down the Oilers' best power play unit. They were 3 for 3 on the penalty kill. Now that is huge for Florida. If they can continue putting up those numbers on Oilers' power plays and get solid performances out of Sergei Bobrovsky, then this could be a series that Florida takes easily. The Edmonton Oilers ultimately performed very well in this series, in this game rather, but ultimately their thing was that they just could not get past the fact that Sergei Bobrovsky was having a world-class performance in goal. And the Oilers, they are predicated on getting those man advantage opportunities, whether it come from McDavid and Leon Draisaitl centering the puck towards the net, or guys like Evan Bouchard from the defensive line banging in shots from the blue line. That's what they are predicated on. However, the Florida Panthers do not care about that, because of the fact that on power plays, their whole defensive structure is built around the fact that, hey, we might not need to be perfect because we know we have a goaltender who can back us up, and Sergei Bobrovsky that can save any shot that the Oilers will throw at him. And he did last night. 2 nights ago, rather. I'm sorry, I'm getting all mixed up with the scheduling of both of these finals. But also, let's look at the Florida Panthers offense, because kudos to them for taking the shots that they were given. Obviously, the Oilers defense, to only give up 15 shots, played a fantastic game. But the problem is Stuart Skinner. Stuart Skinner just needed to be more attuned to what was going on around him, and he just was not up to that task. Obviously, if you look at the Florida goals, they were kind of well-produced team goals, but Stuart Skinner could have definitely saved at least one of them, in my opinion. But let's not dwell on that fact. Let's dwell on the fact that the Oilers, in order to take this series, will need to be very mindful of how Stuart Skinner plays the goaltending position, and B, on the offensive end, try and create more opportunities for Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl in front of net, whilst also trying to figure out ways to get long-distance shots from Sergei Bobrovsky. Because here's the thing. Sergei Bobrovsky in this NHL postseason has been one of the best goalies in terms of stopping the 5-hole shot. If you're not familiar with hockey, the 5-hole shot is when you go between the goaltender's legs. So Sergei Bobrovsky, in terms of stopping shots down low, has been one of the best goalies in the postseason in that respect. However, a lot of the goals that he has let up have come from his blocker side, where it's above his shoulder. So that's what the Edmonton Oilers need to look at. Getting long-range shots, but also trying to find ways to create this kind of production and distraction around the net to get Sergei Bobrovsky a little bit more confused, having to move his body more laterally so that they can open up spaces around him to get their shots in the net. So that should be Edmonton's ultimate number 1 goal. Number 2 goal is seeing if Stuart Skinner can live up to the hype. Stuart Skinner, obviously, while probably the best Edmonton goalie they've had in the Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl era, he still needs to play up to the level that his defense expects of him, because at the end of the day, the Edmonton penalty kill, the Edmonton defense in general, can just be fantastic, but at the end of the day, it is Stuart Skinner's crease to protect. I'm going to keep on saying this for as long as the series goes on. Stuart Skinner is going to be the most scrutinized player in this series, and it's reflected in his fantasy stats. If you can't save 17 shots, if that's the amount of shots that Florida gets off, then I'm not sure the Edmonton Oilers are primed to win this series. You can do everything right around your goaltender, but at the end of the day, the Edmonton Oilers goaltender, Stuart Skinner, needs to step up. But let's just go back to the Florida Panthers for a second. What an incredibly structured team. This team kind of reminds me of the Celtics in the NBA, where you can get fantasy production, you can get point production from any player on this team, as seen by Carter Verhaeghe, a guy who didn't necessarily have a fantastic conference finals, but stepped up to the plate in the first game of the Stanley Cup Finals. And then Alexander Barkov doing what guys who are captains of this team, leaders of this team, have to do in order to get their team across the hump. That's what's scary about the Florida Panthers. Even though Edmonton did the best they could do and limited the shots that the Florida Panthers got, they still were able to put up 3 goals, obviously at the end of the game when it was an empty net goal, but they were still able to score goals. This series is going to come down to who makes their chances, who takes their chances. If the Edmonton Oilers can't solve Sergei Bobrovsky, they are in for a long series. They have to find ways to create long-range shots. Evan Bouchard, I'm looking at you. I know I haven't mentioned his name because obviously these two stars in McDavid and Draisaitl also didn't produce, but Evan Bouchard, you have to be the guy to stick a puck past Sergei Bobrovsky, get this team going, because he has been the guy that the Oilers have turned to in terms of long-range shots that can really confuse a goaltender. So look for Evan Bouchard to be the kind of breakout player that the Edmonton Oilers need in order to win the Stanley Cup, because if they don't solve Bobrovsky, like I said, they're in for a very, very long series. But that will just about do it for the NBA, NHL portion of today's show. Coming up next, we are going to be looking at candidates who are primed for bounce-back years in terms of fantasy football. It should be a fantastic segment. These are a lot of different players who, whether or not they're stars or looking to become stars yet again after fantastic breakout seasons that might have stood alone after they got injured. It's going to be a great segment that you guys do not want to miss. So we'll be right back with that segment, and should it be a good one.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows. Available every...
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. So we are now done with the NBA, NHL portions of today's show. We are going to jump right into fantasy football. This should be a fantastically intriguing segment due to the fact that I'm going to be looking at who ESPN believes to be bounce-back candidates for your fantasy football team. So these are guys who might have been injured the last couple of years, might have had good seasons that they couldn't follow up on because they haven't seen the field as often. So I think this is going to be a segment that you guys might want to tune into because of the fact these guys could be huge risks but also high rewards. So high risk, high reward players who you can slot right into your fantasy team and pray that they do well. So without further ado, let's get right into this segment. So, let's start off at the quarterback position for these bounce-back players. Obviously, you can see that there are a wide range of players that are going to show up on my screen. So let's just start off with the quarterbacks. And a guy who everyone knows his name, he's always inevitable, he'll always be around for as long as he chooses to play, Aaron Rodgers. Now, I know what you're thinking. He's a 40-year-old guy, and the Jets don't have the best offensive line around him, as we saw last year, where 4 snaps into the season, he tore his Achilles. Now, we still cannot forget that Aaron Rodgers, the last time he played, was stellar. Stellar for the Packers. 36,000 yards, over 36,000 yards, and 26 touchdowns. So, you can see the fact that even as he's getting up there in age, even as he gets more injury prone, Aaron Rodgers is still a solid QB. I think he's going to be stellar. We're going to have to see how the Jets' offensive line holds up around him, but he definitely has the offensive weapons in Garrett Wilson, Breece Hall. He has a guy in Allen Lazard he's had a connection with from the Jets, from the Packers. So he definitely has the talent around him to be a guy you might want to look into, but is still very injury prone. That's the only deal with Aaron Rodgers. He's still very injury prone as he gets up there in age. Obviously the oldest QB right now in the NFL. So it's just a thing where you have to look at it in ways of, okay, I know he can put up the stats that he did a couple years ago in Green Bay because of the fact that the Jets' offensive weapons are highly promising. I truly expect Aaron Rodgers and Garrett Wilson to be one of the better QB wide receiver tandems in the NFL next season. But it's just about staying on the field for Aaron Rodgers going forward as he heads towards the inevitable retirement that everyone's expecting. I can see him playing for quite some time and being a guy who you can rely on in terms of fantasy, maybe not a higher-end QB like a Mahomes or a Lamar or a Josh Allen, but Aaron Rodgers will always be there, and he's a name that everyone can rally around because of the fact he's been doing it for several years. Now, another QB that I'm kind of interested to see next year as he transitions from an offense where he had one of the best receivers in the league to an offense that wants to have some of the best receivers in the league, Kirk Cousins. Kirk Cousins moves from Minnesota, where he had fantastic setup in Kevin O'Connell's scheme. He had a guy in Jay Jettis he could always rely on. He was always open and always reliable. Now he moves to a Falcons squad that has never really had that good QB play and solid QB play. Obviously, last season, Kirk Cousins tore his Achilles as well. And he's coming in. He's a huge risk. He's also getting up there in age. But he's in a Falcons setup that I really like for him. I think that in terms of players who I want to see produce, I want to see all these players on the Falcons offense really step up. Now that Arthur Smith is gone, expect more targets to go to guys like Bijan. Expect Drake London to really have a breakout year. I could see him being at least in the wide receiver 10 to 15 range. If Kirk Cousins plays up to his potential, I can see Kyle Pitts being a breakout player. But it's all because of the fact that right now, Kirk Cousins is in a fantastic system. He's one of the best QBs the Falcons have had in the past 2 years. And ultimately, if Kirk Cousins does get injured, the Falcons at least have a QB option in Michael Penix Jr., who they think they can rely upon, so we'll have to see. But in terms of fantasy, look for Kirk Cousins to be a potential steal. I still think he's very risky coming off an Achilles. hasn't played in a while, and Achilles are very tricky injuries to come back from, especially at the quarterback position. But look for Kirk Cousins to want to really elevate this young Falcons squad and really help it out offensively. I think that Kirk Cousins in this system will definitely thrive if he stays healthy. And speaking of staying healthy and a guy who you just saw on my screen, let's move to the running backs and a guy in Nick Chubb who had one of the most devastating injuries last year in the NFL. And a lot of people saying that he might not even be the same guy ever again because of the fact that it was such a devastating injury. But Nick Chubb, whenever he is on the field, he's a top 5 fantasy running back, and you can't look past that factor. Obviously, a lot of people are so emotionally invested in Nick Chubb's story right now because of the fact that he has always been one of the guys you look to for your fantasy squad. Probably one of the running backs you would take even over a Christian McCaffrey, let's say. But right now, he is kind of a risk. This is the second time a similar injury has happened to him, the first in his college career. And now, in a year where he was looking to be one of the top 3 running backs, if not overall top fantasy running back. So, definitely, it's kind of a sad, weird story surrounding Nick Chubb. I hope the best for him because when he plays, he's electric. He really helps that Browns offense, and he could help your fantasy offense. But right now, I'm kind of wary of Nick Chubb and his injury history. So I'm going to say fade him, and it saddens me to say that. But right now, I just don't see Nick Chubb being the same. But a guy who could be the same is Jonathan Taylor. Jonathan Taylor is definitely being overlooked, in my opinion, due to the fact he just had that one breakout year in 2021 when he was still a rookie, and now he's kind of fallen off. Injury bugs hit him as well, but he's in a Colts system that's really exciting, in my opinion. Shane Steichen really implemented a lot of different ideas. Anthony Richardson's finally going to get a full season, fingers crossed, of playing at that QB position. And Jonathan Taylor, I really think, can benefit from that. One of the better receiving running backs in the league, in my opinion. A lot of value. If you're playing in a PPR league, I think Jonathan Taylor is a running back, rather, you take immediately because of the fact he can receive out of the backfield. Look for a lot of screen action between him and Anthony Richardson. So I'm really intrigued to see if Jonathan Taylor can get back to that player we know he can be when he broke out in 2021. Now let's go kind of more to the wide receiver positions. Now this is an interesting kind of thing to talk about because of the fact that so many different wide receivers can have breakout years, but their contract situations might be a little bit muddy. And so let's start off with T. Higgins. Obviously, he finally had his contract situation settled and situated. He's going to play for the Bengals next year. But I do think that T. Higgins is often overestimated, in my opinion. He's in a kind of Bengals receiving room that really relies on Jamar Chase and Tyler Boyd's up and coming. So I'm really, really not necessarily feeling T. Higgins. Obviously, he hasn't had a year where he's not gone under 1,000 yards just yet. But I do feel like his production's going to wane. I think that Joe Burrow's favorite target in that system is Jamar Chase. And there's just a weird feeling surrounding both T. Higgins and the whole Bengals organization where they felt that he could hold out for a little bit longer. And ultimately, they did get it settled. But I just think that wide receivers with muddy contract situations are really not necessarily as focused on the season as they should be. So it's wait and see with T. Higgins. I wouldn't necessarily take him. He has had fantastic fantasy seasons. I can attest to that because I've had him on my fantasy team in past years, and he has truly shined. But right now, with the way his whole contract situation played out, I just don't think his mind is going to be on football this year. I think that's going to be a little bit of a distraction to start off the year for T. Higgins. But a guy who I'm really, really intrigued to see now that he's not the number one target anymore for the LA Rams, as you can see on my screen, Cooper Kupp. Obviously, Cooper Kupp, when he came back to the LA Rams, was expected to be the number one receiver, but then no one expected the emergence of Puka Nacua as a fifth-round rookie to happen because of the fact that everyone knew that Cooper Kupp was the number one go-to guy, and everyone thought Matthew Stafford would underperform as a result. But now Puka Nacua is now viewed as the new number one go-to target for this LA Rams team. So I really think that Cooper Kupp still has it in him. He's an incredibly versatile player. I don't think he's going to be concerned with the development of Puka Nacua. In fact, I think he's glad because he's not going to be as double teamed as much. So I think he's going to be a very, very one of the most non-risky players to take in this whole segment because of the fact he's so versatile and the fact that he's not going to get as much coverage on him because of the fact that Puka Nacua is emerging as well. So look out for Cooper Kupp. I think he can be a potential steal. So that will just about do it. Oh yes, I forgot about Mark Andrews in there as well, the only tight end on this list. Mark Andrews, obviously another player who got injured in the postseason, still had a fantastic year. Always a go-to target in that Ravens system, probably the number one go-to receiver for Lamar Jackson because of the fact that the Ravens haven't really built around their receiving core. So Mark Andrews, obviously, he's a player who has been healthier than most on this list, but just last year, getting injured in the postseason, we'll have to see how he returns. But obviously, he's one of the preeminent tight ends in the league. Probably a tight end 3 in my opinion because he's just that good for the Baltimore Ravens offense. And now that should just about do it for this segment of today's show. But coming up next, we move from guys who I think are going to have big, fantastic bounce-back years to guys who you might want to stay away from because of their value. These is the overvalued fantasy players who you have to be wary of. And we're going to start talking about ADP and what that means in terms of fantasy. So that should be a very interesting part of the segment. So we will be right back with that, and you definitely don't want to miss it.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We're in the home stretch of today's show, but these last two segments should be really, really interesting and fun ones, so do stick around for them. We move from guys who I think are primed for big bounce back years, guys willing to take a risk on, to guys who may be a bit overvalued in terms of their ADP, and we'll get into what that means if you're new to fantasy in a minute. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Starting off hot, really, in my opinion, with a guy who, while he was a tight end 1 last year, really might not be in a season where all these different tight ends are really going to shine. So this is a guy who still is one of the best tight ends in the league, but you might be overrating slightly, and that is Sam Laporta of the Detroit Lions. Right now, his ADP, which, if you're new to fantasy, is average draft position, where they are projected to go in a typical fantasy draft, is 29.8, so he's sitting kind of in the 3rd round, which is really good for a tight end. But in terms of what PFF is saying, Pro Football Focus, he's not necessarily one of the best tight end ones we've had in recent years. In fact, last year when he was the tight end 1, it was the worst tight end 1 season since 2017. So as you can see, while Sam Laporta was a top dog in terms of fantasy production last year, it wasn't as convincing as previous years where tight ends really broke out. And in terms of the Lions offense, I really think that Sam Laporta's production will go down. It's just a very exciting offense. Obviously, the emergence of Jameson Williams as he comes back after being suspended for most of the last season, and obviously Amon-Ra St. Brown becoming a top 5 wide receiver in the NFL in my opinion when he's on his game. I think that Sam Laporta even though he's a very interesting part of this Lions offense and what Ben Johnson does with it, I just think his production will wane a little bit because of the fact they have so much talent at the position. Jared Goff is willing to spread the wealth around, and maybe there was a reason as to why his tight end 1 performance last year was not as convincing. So, look to fade Sam Laporta. I know it's kind of shocking to say because he has been such a huge name in terms of the fantasy rumor mills and the way he stepped up last year for the Lions offense. But right now, I think that he's one of those players who, if you look at his fantasy metrics, aren't as impressive as some others. He's sitting way below the median in terms of certain fantasy scoring metrics, behind guys who are much more high profile than like guys like Travis Kelce's, even Jake Ferguson, Trey McBride, guys of that nature, really showing that they are the ones who should be looked at in terms of fantasy and not Sam Laporta. There are a lot of worrying storylines and threads to kind of point to the fact that Sam Laporta isn't as convincing as people think. But coming in next, a running back who moves to a team that's not necessarily known for their run-first philosophy in Josh Jacobs. I think that Josh Jacobs, he's really had a very weird fantasy career in my opinion. He was as high as RB3, but then he had years where he was as low as RB12, and just speaks to the fact that he hasn't had that much volume or efficiency in previous years. Now he moves to a Green Bay Packers team where he's not the number 1 option anymore, and he's not going to see as many carries as people expect. I think that he had a much better situation in Las Vegas, where he was seen as the heartbeat of that offense. But now, Green Bay Packers offense with Jordan Love and these young receivers who are really exciting, and I want to see what they do next year. And a running back in A.J. Dillon who's really stepping up into their role. Obviously, he's going to be the RB1 in my opinion because of the fact that they lose Aaron Jones. But as we see with Josh Jacobs, he now has to take a back seat he's very unfamiliar with. Right now, his average draft position is mid-4th round, and I actually think that's a bit too high for him. I would fade Josh Jacobs a lot more than I would say Sam Laporta right now. He is very low in a lot of projections, only 39th out of 49 qualified running backs in terms of rushing yards over expected. So you can see his decline as he progresses through the years. And here's an interesting fact about Packers running backs that should really make you wary of choosing a guy like Josh Jacobs or even a guy like A.J. Dillon, however exciting he may be. No Packers running back has eclipsed 240 carries since Eddie Lacy, remember him, in 2014. So as you can see, the Packers really are not that worried about their running backs. Obviously, that could be a testament to the fact that Mike McCarthy's now gone, and Matt LaFleur has really looked to try and establish a young quarterback in Jordan Love as a passer. But going forward, I think that these 2 running backs are guys I would fade. I do like A.J. Dillon, and I think he's going to be the RB1, but Josh Jacobs is someone I'm really, really wary about. Another running back who I'm kind of wary about as well is a guy in Rachaad White who does not scream RB1 to me. Obviously, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers have not been known for good running backs, not since Doug Martin did they have a reliable option at the running back position. But Rachaad White as well is one of those guys who would just fade. Right now, his average draft position sits at 56.5, kind of in those mid-3rd, 4th round ranges. And the big question about him is, will he keep his job? Obviously, they drafted a couple of nice prospects. They have a guy in Chase Edmonds who I really like. Sean Tucker's one of the more underrated college running backs of the past couple of years. He comes into this team. So it's just a question of who the Tampa Bay Buccaneers want at that position. I think it's one of those weird running back rooms where no one is seen above the other guy, and I think that they're just going to rotate in and out. There's going to be limited minutes for each and every single one of them, and Rachaad White might fall to the wayside because of it. In terms of efficiency, I just think that with the touches he does get, he needs to prove that he can be one of those bell cow kind of running backs who doesn't necessarily score touchdowns, but can get you a nice number of yards for your fantasy squad. I think that Rachaad White, should he be one of those players who breaks out, needs to do it in terms of yards, because right now I don't necessarily see him as much of a touchdown threat. So these three guys, I think, Sam Laporta, Josh Jacobs, and Rachaad White, have really a lot of things in common. One, they're in position groups that really are very crowded. Obviously with Sam Laporta, obviously he's the number one tight end in Detroit still, but he's still in a wide receiver or skill position group rather that really is going to be elevated due to the fact that you have guys who are on the rise at each of their respective positions, and the emergence of Jameson Williams could really hurt him as well, like I said. And then a guy in Josh Jacobs who really moves away from, I think, a better position for him to a team that hasn't really been a run-first squad. And then last but not least, in Rachaad White, who just simply needs to stay on the field to prove himself. I just think that none of these guys in my mind are necessarily too overrated, but they're guys who I would just be wary of drafting, in my opinion. I think that PFF got these guys right on the money because of the fact that they're either not in necessarily good situations for who they are as players, but also the fact that they haven't really been impressive in terms of the number one thing that's important, and that's fantasy metrics. So looking at these three players, I think that take them at your own peril. I really think that Sam Laporta is the one guy I wouldn't have put on this list just because he did have a tight end one season and he was a rookie. But I can get where they are coming from with it. Josh Jacobs and Rachaad White, however, I really think you should fade. But that's just coming from me. And that should just about do it for the fourth segment of today's show. Coming up in the last segment, I'm really, really thrilled and excited to offer you guys even more Euros action. We talked about drafting your fantasy squad, the guidelines and rules for how to play. Now I'm going to give you tips and tricks. If you haven't started thinking about your Euros fantasy squad, do it now because of these tips and tricks I'm about to tell you coming back from the break. We will be right back to discuss that. It should be a can't miss segment. Hello everyone and welcome back to the last segment of today's show, and it should be a fantastic banger of a segment. We've obviously talked a little bit about Euros Fantasy. I took you guys through the rules of how to play. I've analyzed my own Euros Fantasy squad, and now, if you haven't yet decided who you wanted on your Euros Fantasy squad, I am just going to give you guys some tips and tricks of how to deal with your roster. Obviously, with a limited budget and only 15 players that you can draft into your squad, it does kind of get a little dicey in terms of who to pick. So this segment is all about helping you figure out how to balance your squad and ultimately build a squad that is well structured and has players at each position that can contribute. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Starting off at number one in terms of tips and tricks, according to me, how about the case for the defensive side of things? Obviously, defenders are much less valued than your strikers, but also they are some of the more integral players in terms of your fantasy squad because of the fact that if they get clean sheets, ball recoveries is another huge stat. They definitely can help you pull out some games. So, obviously, what with these summer tournaments as well, you have to think that these are going to be low-scoring, cagey affairs due to the fact that these players have played domestic seasons for a long period of time, and they might be a bit more tired. So in terms of that, defenders can also really help you in terms of deciding who you want in your backline. So, in terms of players or teams to look out for on the market for defenders, how about Portugal? Portugal only allowed 2 goals in their entire qualifying campaign, 17 games of qualifying, only 2 goals. So look for guys at a low budget, because remember, you only have 100 million euros to spend leading up to the Euros at the very least. Obviously, you get more as the rounds progress. But starting off, look for Portugal. I said they're the dark horses of the tournament, and their defense definitely is a huge part of that. So look for cheap options in guys like Ruben Diaz, who will only set you back 6 million. And then Diogo Dalot at 5 million is such a good value player, a very underrated right back. He gets a lot of flack for playing at Man United, but Diogo Dalot can do the job for you in your back line. Honestly, here's a good strategy. Draft your defenders first. They are the lowest valued players in terms of budget, so look to draft from the back as you are building your team, because honestly, you can save a little money if you want to spend big as you get to the striker position, because there are a lot of different intriguing strikers who you can take up there, but still draft from the back, because in my opinion, you can get a lot of high value players that can really separate you from people who draft from the front, so be wary of that. Coming in next, this is a fantastic one to know, and just be a no-brainer for anyone who's a seasoned vet in terms of daily fantasy soccer or Euros fantasy soccer. Always look for the country's penalty takers. Know who the country's penalty takers are, because the penalty takers obviously get you goals, and goals are the cream of the crop stat for fantasy. So, a lot of guys know that you can't always get what you want in terms of fantasy, and guys like Kane and Cristiano Ronaldo will be hard to come by should you choose to value strikers over defenders, because of the fact that they're expensive, and then you'll have to think more about who you want in your backline. So, while Kane and Ronaldo are expensive, here are some guys you definitely need to know in order to, balance your budget and still be crafty with penalty takers scoring so many goals and winning you guys games ultimately. So Rodri, he is the penalty taker for Spain. Obviously, he's kind of a risk in that midfield role, not known for his goal scoring threat, but as a penalty taker, he's low value as well. He is only rated at 4 million, so do look to add him as a high value pick should he score a lot of penalties, should Spain get a lot of penalties. And then Ilkay Gundogan, penalty taker for Germany. Obviously, Germany have had a lot of struggles in front of net, so if they do get a lot of penalties, look for Ilkay Gundogan to be one of the highest value players in their squad, even though he's not necessarily going to help you in many other respects. So, knowing a country's penalty taker is vital if you decide to put a premium on goals as your main kind of scoring output for your squad. Coming in at number 3, this is also a very interesting rule as well. Obviously, with the Euros, roles are very defined for different players. Obviously, different players get assigned different roles, so you have to look out for them as well, because if you find a hybrid player, they can really help you. For example, a guy who can play in both the midfield and in the defense as well could be a huge asset. And without further ado, I will tell you some of those guys. Alexander Zinchenko, he's going to be a huge part of this Ukrainian squad. He is the heartbeat of that Ukrainian squad, and his hybrid style of play contributes to that fact. He is a left back and midfield hybrid who can put balls into the box, can drop back and recover. I think that Alexander Zinchenko will be a fantastic addition. I don't think Ukraine will get far, so look to drop him after the group stages, but Alexander Zinchenko, at least early on in the round, is one of those players who is going to be utilized in different roles, who can really help in terms of fantasy point production. Another guy who might stay at the right back position for most of this Euros for Germany, but a guy who still can step into the midfield and make things happen, as we've seen throughout his domestic seasons. Joshua Kimmich, he's an inverted fullback who can A, go back and recover, and B, step into the midfield if needed for a German squad who's looking for a lot of goal production. I think he's going to be a high-risk, high-reward kind of player because he is going to be tasked with helping lead that Germany backline where there's more questions than their attack. So we'll have to see how Joshua Kimmich plays in that role, but I still think he could be a nice little steal as a pick there because of the fact he can have a lot of assists from that right back spot. But that should just about do it for the players in different roles portion. We are now going to move to a thing that I kind of can get behind, but still not necessarily wanting to take that much of a risk on, if you know what I mean. And that is the whole young striker conundrum. Do you take a risk on a young striker in hopes of them having a good tournament, or do you want an established stud? Because young strikers, they can be very, very streaky. They can definitely score a lot of goals for you, but ultimately, they also are kind of a wishful thinking kind of thing, where you kind of have to hope and pray that A, their team gets far, and B, that they are the ones scoring the goals for you, because ultimately, a striker position is such a valuable position as well, because goals are the ways you win these games. You have to have players who can score goals, and young strikers might not be able to do that. But if you are looking for a couple to go with, consider Rasmus Højlund in a Denmark squad that's kind of embracing that underdog mentality at 7.5 million. Not going to break the bank there. I think that Rasmus Højlund can be a sneaky steal, but we'll have to see how this Denmark squad plays coming off very emotional tournaments back to back. So I think that taking a flyer on Højlund could be a good thing, or it could backfire. Another guy who I really kind of like for a team that I don't really think will make that much waves in the group stage is Benjamin Sesko. I think that he will have a nice group stage, but ultimately his team will not go far. He's valued at 7 mil, so he's not going to break the bank for you there. But ultimately, those two guys are huge risks in my opinion. Yes, they had nice little domestic campaigns. Obviously, it took Højlund a bit longer than Sesko to find his footing. But these are two guys who ultimately are playing on teams that I don't really expect to go far in the tournament. Obviously, who knows about Denmark, but Slovenia, I mean, come on. I don't think Slovenia is going to do well. They could be nice in the group stage if you need a striker for the group stage and you're looking to build on the fact that as you go on and you get more budget, you can go for the top line strikers. But still, I think that these two guys are guys who are a huge risk. Another guy who's not a young striker but is still highly undervalued, might not play a lot. Germany's still trying to figure out that whole striker situation. But Niklas Füllkrug, coming off the bench at the very least for Germany, could be an interesting proposition for you there. But moving on to the next tip for you guys, look at defenders who are also corner takers, because corners are also a huge part of soccer. They're a huge part of fantasy soccer as well, because corners can turn into assists very quickly. And if you have a good defender who's a corner taker, not only can they keep a clean sheet and also get a lot of ball recoveries, but they can also add to your point production from your back line being a corner taker. So look for guys like Trent Alexander-Arnold. I don't know how much he'll play in an England squad that is highly competitive along that back line, but should Gareth Southgate choose to put him in some games, I think that he will be the guy tasked with corners. He's a fantastic crosser of the football. So look for Trent Alexander-Arnold at whatever position he plays, should he play in this tournament, to be one of those guys as a defender who can rely upon to take corners and potentially get a lot of assists. Another guy in Andy Robertson. Let's stick with the Liverpool trend here. For Scotland at 5.5 million. He's very underrated in my opinion. I don't necessarily think he'll help you as much in terms of defensive output, but he's still a spectacular crosser of the football, so look for offensive production from Andy Robertson. An underrated player if you're looking for a left-footed defender who Italy might trust for in-swinging corners. I don't think he's going to be one of their corner takers in this tournament, but Fede DiMarco, still one of the best left-backs in the world in my opinion, will help you on the defensive end of the pitch in terms of fantasy soccer. But Fede DeMarco is ultimately one of those guys who you might have to be wary of because he is a fantastic crosser with the football like these other guys. But also, if Italy, should they want a guy who can in-swing the ball into the box for corners, Fede DeMarco will be their guy. Now, last but not least for this segment and for today's show, let's look at how draws can affect this whole mindset when you're going into your Euros fantasy squad. Ultimately, tougher groups means that these players might not get as much production as you think. They're going up against players who are also at the same level as them, so they kind of cancel each other out. So go away from the group of death, which is Italy, Spain, and Croatia. Obviously, these two teams have been battling it out in terms of these past couple of tournaments. These are three very evenly matched teams, so shy away from that group. But also, even though he's up there in age, and I've said that I've faded him, he's number 5 in the Golden Boot race, but I don't really think he's going to be able to do that. Romelu Lukaku, at least in the group stage, in my opinion, can be a steal for you. He is in a very, very weak group, so look for Romelu Lukaku to be one of those guys. I wouldn't take him for the whole tournament, but in the group stage, I guess you can go for him. He's valued at $9 million. A little bit on the pricier side of things, but still not as high as guys like Kane and Ronaldo. So maybe if you want to take a flyer for him on the group stages, then go ahead and do that. But that will just about do it for today's edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. I've been Christopher Shepard. We'll be back tomorrow with a better-than-ever episode, as always. Don't want to miss out on that. It should be another exciting episode. Hope you all enjoyed this edition of the show. It's going to get more exciting. Like, follow, and subscribe to the show, please, and thank you. We will be back tomorrow better than ever.